change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So only after 3 days of arriving, Festus, he goes to Jerusalem and he meets with the most powerful Jews in Israel, the high priest along with the chief priest. And the very first thing that they bring up is Paul. And it's been 2 years now, but Paul is still what's bothering them above everything else, killing Paul. And they just can't come out and say that because though Paul, he's in custody, there's been no formal charges against him. And we're not even sure here that Felix, that he's even met Paul, where you kind of would be thinking, you know, he'd be walking around Caesarea and be saying, well, who's this guy in my house? Or like the realtor there showing the building. And he says, and this room is for the Apostle Paul. But Paul, he is a Roman citizen, and Festus is a Roman governor. Festus is not a Jew. So where the Jews here are asking their new governor for a favor, and they're asking him to bring Paul to Jerusalem to face trial, Festus, he's not going to break Roman protocol to do the Jews a favor. Festus, he's going to uphold the Roman law, though he doesn't know anything probably about this plot that they have to ambush and kill Paul on the way to Jerusalem. Because really, who would really think that the religious men, those who are supposed to represent God, would be putting out a hit on a man that they just don't agree with? Because these are the religious leaders, and they're here and they're conspiring to commit murder. But Paul, he hasn't broken any Jewish laws, let alone any Roman law. But the Jews here, they don't need a conviction. They just need an opportunity to kill him. So in their minds, Paul, he will never see his day in court because he will be murdered on the way. And I don't know if these Jewish leaders, if they're still working with those same Jewish assassins who took that vow not to eat and drink till Paul's dead, who should have been called like the skinny and the thirsty. But this time, it's not the assassins who are instigating the murder. It's not the zealots here. It's the religious leaders. And so Festus, still wanting to do the Jews a favor, and though he's probably not aware of this plot, I'm trying to do this to Paul, he does agree to open up the case against Paul, but only at the palace in Caesarea. So Festus, he tells them to send any of their men who have any authority to go with him so they can accuse Paul to his face, where Festus, he can see if Paul is at fault. And so it's after 10 days, Festus returns, and here we see Festus, he gets right back to business because it says the very next day, he reopens a trial against Paul. And this is actually very smart of him because with Felix, nothing happened for 2 years. But here, Festus, he doesn't want to be accused by Rome of holding any Roman citizen in custody without any charges. And so it's smart of him to try to get rid of this problem very quickly because Festus here, he didn't create the problem, he only inherited it. And for Festus, this is not the only problem he probably has. He's running everything in Judea, being the governor. Okay, so now Festus, he commands Paul to be brought in before the judgment seat. And Festus, he takes his seat as the judge. And now you got all the Jewish leaders, and they're all there. But this time they're there without their high-powered attorney, Tertullus. And so now it's the Jewish leaders who are bringing up all these empty accusations against Paul. But there's no new information. There's nothing they can prove. Where there's no Roman charges of anything worth putting Paul to death for, with no evidence. And Paul's done nothing against Jewish law, nothing against the temple or against Rome. And so So Festus, he should have released Paul right there. And for being a leader with such a good reputation, this was probably his only one mistake. Because Festus, he's trying to build a relationship with the Jewish leadership. And so he does want to do the Jews a favor, where it seems that every Roman governor of Judea, ever since Pontius Pilate, they always wanted to do the Jews a favor. Because this exact phrasing, these exact words have been said about each one of them, wanting to do the Jews a favor, beginning with Pilate. And then we saw it with Felix, and now we see it here with Festus. Because they imagine that this is going to make their job easier to govern them. It's going to be easy to govern them if they're happy. But they're never happy. And with all the favors, it never made the Jews any easier to govern. And that's because the Jews will always hate the Romans, because the Romans are Gentiles and they're in their land. So trying to do the Jews a favor, Festus, he asks Paul and said, "Will you go with me to Jerusalem to be tried in front of me?" We're just having a new change of venue. It would make no sense to Paul because he's already in front of him. And I'm not sure Paul realizes it here, but the only thing that's keeping Paul alive right now is being in Roman custody. The Roman guards are actually protecting him. Where literally without their protection, Paul would be killed the moment he leaves, where Paul would be ambushed. And this would happen no matter where Paul went in the Roman Empire. There would always be someone trying to kill him. But here, Paul, he isn't going to foolishly put his life into the hands of the Jews, because they've already made their intentions clear that they want him killed. And so Paul here, what he does is he claims the right to every Roman citizen who thinks that they're not being treated fairly in a lower court. And so Paul, he just says, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged." And then he explains of how he's done nothing wrong. And if he has done anything deserving death, he's willing to die. But you can't deliver me to these men. So this is like any one of us, how you would appeal to the Supreme Court. And that's what appealing to Caesar means. And the Caesar that Paul is specifically appealing to here is actually the Emperor Nero, who is the new Caesar. But at this time, Nero, he wasn't anti-Christian. That comes later. And so with just one little sentence where Paul says, "I appeal to Caesar," this takes Paul's case out of the hands of the Jews, and it also takes his case out of the hands of Festus. And then we see here in verse 12 that Festus, he checks this out with his legal counsel, where he confirms that he has no choice but to send Paul to Caesar. And so he says, "To Caesar you shall go." And so by Paul taking his case out of Festus's jurisdiction, all Festus can do here is apologize to the Jews, and he can just say, "Well, it's out of my hands now. I tried." But Festus is not going to go against Roman law, because he's not going to risk his own life to make the Jews happy, where he definitely does not want to go up against Nero. But now this has created a problem for Festus, because Paul still has no charges. And he doesn't want to send such a famous prisoner to Nero without any offenses he supposedly committed to go along with him, because this would make Festus look incompetent. We're being Nero's new governor of Judea and sending a prisoner to Nero with no charges, as if Caesar doesn't have enough to do running the whole Roman Empire. We're literally at this time, that's the whole known world. So Nero, he doesn't need any governors like that. He doesn't need governors who can't handle even the smallest cases. So Festus here, he's a little stuck. But it's a good thing for Uncle Festus that the rest of the Adams family, they show up, where they're a little creepy and a little spooky, and they're not really the Adams family, but they're really Herod's family, but they're just as creepy and spooky as the Adams family. And these are the last known members of Herod's family that we know of. where this is the young King Agrippa II, along with his beautiful sister Bernice. And it's more than just rumored that he's living with his sister Bernice as a wife, which infuriated the Jews. The Jews, they hated it because incest is strictly forbidden in the Jewish law, and he's been practicing it openly. And this King Herod Agrippa II, he has the title of being the King of the Jews, or King Agrippa here. He only rules a client kingdom that's northeast of Judea. So his kingdom is up around the area of Lebanon. But Caesar has given him the title of being a king, like his father, because his father was King Herod Agrippa I. But he just has a smaller area. His father, he governed Judea and Samaria. But the emperor has also given King Agrippa II the right to oversee the affairs of the temple in Jerusalem. So he's actually the guy who's in charge of appointing the high priest to the temple in Jerusalem. So that makes King Agrippa an expert in all things Jewish and all religious matters. And this King Herod Agrippa II, he's also the last known Edomite we know of in history, which means that he's a descendant of Esau, which was Jacob's evil twin brother. So he's not Jewish, and all of his descendants were all enemies of the Jews, which also means that his sister Bernice was also an Edomite. And this beautiful sister Bernice, she was only jealous of one person in her life. And we talked about that person the last time we met. And it was her sister Drusilla, who was Felix's wife. And the reason she was jealous is because Drusilla was more beautiful than Bernice, according to Josephus the historian, because Drusilla was stunningly beautiful. And where we read about Drusilla last time, where in the text there, it called her Jewish in the text, which means that their heritage was mixed. But you can't make any mistake here. All the Herods, they all lived like Romans. And so the Herod girls, they were beautiful. And the Herod men, they were perverts. They were all incestuous. And we've seen this all the way back from the life of their grandfather, Herod Antipas. Because if you remember, John the Baptist was imprisoned for telling their grandfather, Herod Antipas, that it was unlawful for him to have his brother Philip's wife, who just also happened to be his niece, where his niece, who he unlawfully wed, her name was Herodias, because she too was a descendant from Herod the Great, where then she had a daughter that did that erotic dance in front of Herod Antipas and his guests, which caused Herod to consent to the beheading of John the Baptist. And that was the same Herod who had mocked Jesus during Jesus' trial in front of Pilate, where Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate with that purple robe, and he's the only person that we ever heard of that Jesus wouldn't even speak to. Okay, and then King Agrippa II, his sister Bernice, they're not strangers to this city of Caesarea. And they're no strangers to the palace here where they're staying, because that was built by their great-grandfather, Herod the Great, who is the same Herod who had built the temple called Herod's Temple. Though there was already a temple there, it's just that Herod, he had made it very elaborate and very grand. And so he's the same Herod that's from the Christmas story, where the Magi, where they came from the east, where he tried to kill baby Jesus in Bethlehem by slaughtering all the male children under 2 years old. So it can be kind of tricky trying to keep track of all the Herods, and it can get a little confusing. But King Agrippa II and his sister Bernice, their father, he was King Agrippa I. And he's the one who had the Apostle James, who was the brother of the Apostle John, beheaded. And we read about him in the very beginning of the book of Acts in chapter 12, where at the end of that chapter, which is only 16 years earlier than this date, we're at this very same city in Caesarea, in this very same amphitheater. He wore that silver-threaded garment that just shimmered in the sunlight when the crowd yelled, "The voice of a God and not a man," where Herod Agrippa the first, he didn't correct them, and he fell down dead and was ate by worms. And just to let you know what happens to these guys, to Agrippa and Bernice, that this affair between them, it doesn't last. They both go on to have different relationships, where Bernice, she actually becomes the mistress of the commander Titus Vespasian. And she actually was his mistress during the time that Titus destroyed Jerusalem and along with the temple in 70 AD, where that Titus, he eventually became the Roman emperor. But before the Senate would confirm him as the new Caesar, they made him leave Bernice because the Romans, they didn't like her. And that's when Bernice, she actually disappears from history. But back here in our story, this young couple, they do what's customary. They go and they visit the new guy in town. So they go pay their respects to the new governor. And the timing couldn't be any better for Festus and his guests, Agrippa and Bernice. For them, this wasn't a very short visit. It says they stayed for what's called many days. And so it doesn't seem like the topic of Paul came up right away. But by hanging out and talking shop, the subject of Paul, it finally comes up. And then Festus, he describes the predicament that he's in about this prisoner left by Felix that he inherited, where it seems to be a religious thing, where Festus, he admits he knows very little about Jewish things, and he's very confused about Paul's case because he can't figure out these charges against him. That even when they had the trial, the Jews were accusing Paul. It seemed like just something about the religion, where Festus here, he shows actually how much he doesn't know about Jesus because he calls him a certain Jesus, because there was a lot of people that was named Jesus, which tells us that up till now, Festus, he hadn't heard anything about Jesus' death or resurrection. But the Jews said that this certain Jesus died, who Paul says is alive. And he says, well, I only asked Paul if he was willing to go to Jerusalem to have a trial. And then what does he go and do? He goes and he appeals to Caesar. So now I'm just waiting, and I'm just keeping him until I have a convenient time to send him. But I don't have any charges to send with him. And that's going to make me look bad in front of Nero, sending an imprisoned Roman citizen without any charges. But now I'm stuck because he appealed to Caesar. And so here, Festus is kind of asking King Agrippa for his help to figure out the charges for him. And King Agrippa and Bernice, they're more than happy to hear Paul. It's almost like the Herods have some kind of sick fascination with God, some kind of twisted viewpoint where their lives are always intersecting with Jesus, where it's just kind of like a form of entertainment for them. And I would guess that the truth is that Jesus' life, it intersects in all of our lives just like this. It's just what we do with him when he shows up in our lives. Do we receive him or do we reject him? Do we mock him or do we even persecute him? And so I'm sure it's not just the Herod's lives that Jesus intersects with, but I believe it's all of our lives. But here again, we get to see Jesus and his testimony come so close to these Herods, these people who are caught up in these fleshy lives, who won't receive him. And honestly, I think, what more could God do to call these people to himself? But these Herods here, they're very excited to hear about Jesus, just like Grandpa Herod Antipas was when he wanted to see Jesus do some magic tricks. And great-grandpa Herod the Great, where he loved hearing from those magi when they came to Jerusalem. And just like Drusilla, the last time we met, she was very interested in hearing Paul's testimony. And you know, these guys, they had to have heard of Paul. And they probably really wanted to find out what kind of charges that they could actually bring against him. Because Agrippa, he has a genuine interest in the temple in Jerusalem. And so Agrippa says, I would also like to hear this man for myself. And then we see again Felix, he gets right to business, where it says it's the very next day. And this isn't going to be a trial. because Paul has already appealed to Caesar. So neither King Agrippa or Festus will be making any type of judgments on Paul. They're just there to listen. So there's no pressure on any of them. So this is a hearing, but this is actually much more than a hearing. This is an event. So everyone who's anyone, they will be there. And they're going to be entering into the auditorium like royalty, where this is like a parade. And we don't just see like centurions there. We see the commanders who commanded the centurions and all their troops, all the military strategists, and every form of Roman official being present. Because this is not only a hearing, but this is a show that's being put on for King Agrippa and Bernice, where it says they came with great pomp, where this is the only place in the Bible where this word pomp is used. But there is a derivative of this word used describing the scene around God's throne, which leads us to believe that this scene here was created to be very intimidating to Paul. And where you have King Agrippa and Bernice, and they're sitting on their thrones with all their royal robes, along with Festus with all his medals, dressed like the governor. And then you have all the military generals and all their uniforms and all the other Roman officials. So this looks like a red carpet event. And then lastly, you have in chains, you have the poor apostle Paul, this small, older Jewish rabbi who's just a tent maker, who's been imprisoned there for 2 years, being brought in front of them, where he stands before this court purely for their entertainment. In this amphitheater in Caesarea, it's still there today, where it has this beautiful view of the Mediterranean Sea, where they still have concerts there. And here Festus' speech to Agrippa, he says to Agrippa that he would like it if Agrippa would examine Paul. But when we read this, we don't see that ever happened. That King Agrippa, who is in charge of this presentation, he just tells Paul, he says, "You're free to speak." And so you got Paul there, and he's probably looking around the room, and he's thinking that this is part of that fulfillment that Jesus had prophesied, that Paul, he'd be speaking before kings, where he's thinking, only God could put together a group like this of kings and leaders. And where he should be intimidated, he's not intimidated at all. He just stretches out his arm, and his hand goes up because he's in charge here. And then Paul, he begins what sounds like that customary flattery. But everything that Paul says here is true. And he means it all very sincerely when he says, "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I will answer for myself before you concerning all the things I'm accused of by the Jews, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews." Where this isn't empty flattery, because it's all true. King Agrippa was an expert in everything Jewish, where up until now, Paul, he's been appearing before pagan Gentile governors. He's been appearing to guys like Felix and Festus, where they didn't understand any of the Jewish things, but Agrippa, he does. And so Paul starts and he says, "Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently." And what he's meaning here, and what he's letting King Agrippa know, is that this is not going to be brief.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,